Alan, you can go ahead and get started.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the conference. My name is Alan Lewis. I'm with Blue Sky Capital Resources, and I'm very excited that we're going to have three panelists today to discuss the economy and what's going on now in a very interesting time post the COVID crisis of the beginning of this year. We have Robert Spendlove, we have Josh Feldstein, and Peter Reichart here. Um, and we're going to begin with Robert. Robert is an economist for Zions Bank, and thought we would begin with him. And I have a few questions prepared that I'm going to ask each of these individually, and then afterwards, please prepare your questions and put them on the chat screen, and Amy will send them over to us to answer them once each of the speakers has given their brief presentation. Okay, Robert. Well, we're in a once in a lifetime event with this COVID. What does the current environment look like, and how can we better understand what to expect moving forward from an economic point of view as business owners, leaders?
Thanks, Alan. It's great to be with you today. I wish we could do this in person, and maybe next year.
Yeah, it would be much better. That was true, but we'll make this work.
Yeah. It really is historic in a number of ways. Unfortunately, all the history is bad history. I wish we were saying this is historically good, but the data that we're seeing is breaking a lot of records, pretty much as far back as we've been keeping records. Now, anecdotally, we hear that things were worse in the Great Depression than they are now. But in terms of the government data that I track, several of our indicators are some of the worst we've ever seen. Probably what's so interesting about this is, it's pretty clear. It's not official yet, but it's pretty clear that we are now in a recession. A recession usually happens over a period of quarters or even years. This has happened in a period of weeks, and so that's created a lot of difficulty in even just tracking what's happening and kind of knowing how the economy is progressing. But we have started to get some more hard data. In fact, just this morning, we got a new reading on GDP, a revised estimate of first quarter GDP, and it dropped 5% in the first quarter. Now, and that's swinging from about a 2% increase in the fourth quarter of 2019. So that's bad enough. But if you think about the time period that we're talking about, first quarter is January, February, and March, and the impacts from the pandemic didn't really even start to occur until nationally March. So we're talking about a swing from 2% growth to 5% contraction in a period of just a few weeks. I expect the second quarter GDP will be a dramatic loss, potentially as much as 30 to 40%. If you look at some of the other indicators, we just got another data point that we just got this morning is unemployment insurance claims. The national level, they came in at another 2.1 million, which means total of 40 million people nationally have now filed for unemployment insurance claims since the beginning of the pandemic. That's about a quarter of the entire US workforce has now filed a claim. In Utah is about 5,500 for a total of 167,000 people in the state of Utah have filed for unemployment insurance claims. Again, historic. A total of, we've now had total job losses In 1 month, in the month of April alone, the nation lost 20 million jobs. During the entire Great Recession, we lost about just under 9 million jobs. The unemployment rate is at an all-time high. Our labor force participation rate has dropped to levels we haven't seen since 1972. And our employment to population ratio, essentially the ratio of people who have a job to the entire population, saw the biggest 1 month drop ever and is now at the lowest level we've ever seen it. We're at about 51.7%. When we look at where it's happening, leisure and hospitality of course, is leading those drops. That sector alone, about 47% of leisure and hospitality jobs have been lost since this began. And so it really is dramatic and historic, and it is something that we've never seen, and I'm hoping we'll never see again.
I would agree with you there, Robert. Let's try to bring it back closer to home. Okay, we know that the national figures are absolutely horrendous, things never seen before. How is Utah and perhaps the western region of the United States? How is Utah fared relative to the U.S.?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because you mentioned Utah and the Western region, and for the past, I would say for the past decade, Utah has been trending very similarly to the Western region, and we've all been doing very well. There's been this kind of ongoing battle between Utah, Nevada, and Idaho for the top spot in a number of different areas. And with this crisis, we've really seen a divergence of that. So one of the things I look at is, again, that unemployment rate. And if you go back to January of this year, so pre-pandemic, the unemployment rate throughout the nation, we were seeing the lowest unemployment rate in the country throughout the nation. In Utah, it was the lowest unemployment rate we've ever seen, at about 2.5%. I mean, think about it. Our biggest struggle just a few months ago was a labor shortage. And as comparison, Nevada was at 3.6%. When you jump forward to March, we start to see those rates going up. Utah moved up to 3.6%. Nevada moved up to 6.3%. Then if you fast forward to our latest data in April, every state has seen their unemployment rate skyrocket. But what's really interesting is Nevada now has the highest unemployment rate in the nation at 28.2%. So that's the official number from April. I mean, the actual unemployed right now is even worse than that. Now, this is one of the areas where, yes, Utah has been hit, and Utah has been severely impacted by this. But we were well positioned going into this, and we're still showing a lot of strength. So the Utah unemployment rate is now at 9.7%. So we're one of the few states that have kept our unemployment rate below 10%. Our employment growth for the month of April is actually the highest in the country. Now it's down significantly from where it was, but we're still growing about 2.5%, which is really strong. Our population growth continues to be one of the strongest in the country, growing just behind Idaho. And one of the important things, one of the kind of natures of Utah growth is that so if you compare Utah to Idaho, the vast majority of Idaho's population growth is from migration, or people moving into the state. Utah population growth, on the other hand, is driven by a natural increase, or our own children and grandchildren. So as we move along this pandemic, we're going to see that migration dropping off, but that natural increase will continue to fuel the strength in the Utah economy.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. That's very encouraging to hear. Um, what would we're hearing many things in terms of, are we going to have a V-shaped recovery, or are we going to have a U-shaped recovery? Is it going to be an L?
W.
And a W?
X.
um, or is it going to be a square root? I've heard. What are your thoughts in terms of what's the most likely outcome as we move forward as a country? I would agree with your analysis, that your view that the West is going to do probably much better than most of the rest of the United States, and for those very reasons that you mentioned earlier. But overall, where do we go going forward for the economy?
Yeah, and that's one of the top items of debate right now among economists. Is kind of we know we feel like we have a good idea of what's happened, although that's still not entirely clear. Then the next question is, when do we hit that trough? When do we hit that bottom in our economic change? And then how does the economy emerge from this, and how quickly? Is it that, so a V recovery would imply that we quickly return back to where we were before the recession. So I would say, if you define that, I would define that as returning back to economic output and employment before the recession. So maybe the end of 2019 or January of 2020. So in terms of the trough, we're starting to see signs that we have hit the bottom. Now, and I think it's actually happening right now. That the unemployment insurance claims peaked several weeks ago and are now actually coming down. So even though they're at historic highs and they're 4 times or more the usual unemployment insurance claims, they're coming down off those highs. We're seeing things reopening. The stay-at-home orders are coming down, and people are going back to restaurants and back to stores, and they're re-entering the workforce. One of the good signs is some of the federal support is not being fully utilized, and that's a good sign that we've hit that bottom. We're starting to come out. But then the question is, okay, so how do we get back to that? Again, the definition is back to the pre-recession levels. I don't think that a V is possible. I don't think we're going to quickly return back to those pre-recession levels. To me, it's really whether it's going to be, there's kind of 3 different scenarios that are being discussed. Either kind of a U-shaped scenario where we stay lower and then come back to pre-recession levels. They're calling it a Nike swoosh, where it was a quick drop and then a gradual rise, but it takes a long time to get back there. Or the worst case scenario is the L-shaped recovery. In other words, we drop and we never achieve the pre-recession levels because of the fundamental change. And so I'm kind of a middle of the road on this. I think we're going to see that swoosh recovery. We will recover and we'll come out of this, but it will take several years to be back to our pre-recession levels. And it could take, it could take, if you look at the Great Recession, it took almost a decade to get back to those pre-recession levels. Now, why is that? Even though we don't have right now, we don't have those government-imposed stay-at-home orders, we're still in the early stages of the pandemic. We're still waiting for the vaccine. We're waiting for treatments. We don't know if there's going to be another wave. And until we have that solution, individuals, consumer confidence specifically, is still way down. It's much below where it was before the recession. And people are very reluctant to go back to what they were doing before. So even though restaurants are open again, their occupancy is much below where it was pre-recession, at around 20 to 30%. Restaurants need occupancy of about 70% to be profitable. So there will be several restaurants that may not be able to make it through this. If you look at airlines are down, 80 to 90%. Cruise, the cruise line sector has been severely impacted. Hotels, even retail is still has been dramatically impacted by up to the tune of about 80 to 90%. And so until we can move through that, it's going to be very tough to return back to where we were. And in that period of time, when those businesses cannot return to their pre-recession levels, those that are not well capitalized and those that do not have the ability to move through this are very likely going to go bankrupt or go out of business.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to end on a negative note, but we still have two more of our panelists to go through. Thank you, Robert, for this. But these are, this is a period of time that we've never experienced before. And I think the important thing for everyone to realize is that anybody who tells you exactly that they know exactly how it's going to finish out over the next 2 years is lying. Because nobody knows. I've been in the business for 30 plus years, and I don't know. Best I can do is make educated guesses, and that's really all we're really trying to do, is to try to lay a framework as to what we should expect, and prepare for the worst, but anticipate, hope for the best, I'd like to bring Josh in, and Josh's expertise, and it comes right back to directly with COVID-19, and that his involvement has been in the healthcare business for his career. He's the CEO of Kava Robotics, and has done significant work throughout the healthcare industry for large healthcare networks, in terms of economic planning and budgeting for for the longer term, in terms of what goes on in our healthcare system. And I'd like to begin, Josh, with the very first question is what does this event mean for the healthcare network in America?
Well, first of all, Alan, thanks for having me. I think it might be helpful if we all start off taking a moment or two to untangle this a bit. I would say, just as a foundation setter, that the pandemic and the economic burdens that it is causing, that Robert was referencing, are pressuring people to increase their knowledge of some very difficult subject matter: medicine, infectious disease, medical research and development, the politics of science generally. That's a tall and complicated order for the majority of Americans. So in short, I would first say that the downturn is bound up in some scientific subjects that require a lot of background to contextualize correctly. And that's a very important point. I would also say that the downturn is also set on a foundation in which Americans have to rely on limited, and I do really mean limited, lay media for information. We're not talking about medical conferences or peer review publications or expert opinion from world experts. but rather a barrage really from mainstream sources, old media, YouTubers galore, and even so-called official sources have really been quite unreliable and wildly inconsistent. And all of this adds up to a lot of contradiction, a lot of confusion. Recall that back in February, the health commissioner of New York City and Dr. Fauci from the NIH both said there was nothing to be concerned about regarding COVID-19. That was late February. A month later, the world closed down. We were looking for information and guidance from mass media sources. CNN, as an example, reported for weeks that Kim Jong-un from North Korea was dead or dying when he was in absentia. And then poof, he was alive again. So what we hear, what we see, what we read is really a wide variability. So buyer beware when it comes to the news. You know, your point that anybody who says they know what the outcome is going to be is lying. I would say that the next issue that we should address from a healthcare perspective about the downturn is how do non-expert audiences in healthcare react to medical information that's really out of context. There is really, to be absolutely clear, almost nothing in medicine that's black and white. And this falls into the category of a little medical knowledge can really be dangerous. Let me give you a few examples of some of the challenges we're facing. Real simple ones like face masks, right? This is a medical technology when it's used correctly, but it's lost on most people. My mask protects you, and the your wearing of a mask protects me. I mean, that's the basic idea in the public. But few people are wearing some kind of face mask or wearing one that's either useful, either an N95 or an HN95, or a fabric face mask with a HEPA filter that can actually filter out the very small particle sizes of a COVID virus. And the other component is that to wear a mask correctly is the key. It has to fit. So the fit of a mask is critical for it to be effective, and most people don't get this. Masks are falling down, they're poorly fit, there's space behind the ear loops, makes the mask useless. So we have the need for using medical technology, and yet people can't seem to get their arms around this. Social distancing, it's still haphazard. Following medical guidelines is something that Americans really fail to take seriously, even pre-pandemic and pre-recession. Eating healthy, achieving necessary weight, getting enough exercise, etc. Most people don't follow these guidelines. 70% of America is either obese or overweight. So after 4 months of hearing about social distancing, look at our beaches and our boardwalks. It's everywhere. So yes, our economic struggles are bound up in solving healthcare issues, yet to unravel COVID-19, it's a really complex issue. And the uncertain dynamic is going to proceed over the next months and years in fits and starts. The guidance has been contradictory at times. For example, wipe everything down that enters your house, said the CDC. But last week they said, but you don't have to do that because now it's not necessary. So, these are the kinds of things that confuse people. And we are reaching a point, I think, where people are starting to hit medical information overload, and being able to interpret all this information and to guide our actions accordingly in terms of going back to work, taking care of our family, quarantining, get out into society, getting back to the economic business of daily living. People are really struggling at this point, I think, to put all the pieces together. We can talk more about this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Josh. Another thought along this line, question I have along this line is that the economy is just now beginning to reopen, which is fabulous, which is good news. Okay, and despite the shortcomings that we see that you've mentioned here in terms of how Americans are notorious for not following rules and regarding the face masks and social distancing, etc. But it's very important to go over this, because one of the things that that I come up with as a question, and it's a question that's being mentioned, that's being asked right now, is that given that the economy is just now opening up, what are the odds? What is the risk? And I know that you'll be taking, a wild guess, but an educated guess because you're somewhat in the field, um, of us having to face the choice or the decision of having to close again or partially close at some point in the future, whether it be a month down the road, 2 months down the road, or is there a point in time in the future where, okay, now we can, we've got to half hold our breath for the next 3 months and then we know we're going to be clear? How should we look at this?
Well, one size does not fit all.
Yeah,
And I think
exactly.
one of the things that is so alarming with regard to politicians and government lining out the way people in America should respond is that they are basing their directives on the interpretation of wildly varied medical information from so-called experts who themselves don't have answers to these questions. So now it comes down to individual decision making. If a person is in a high risk category or they are living in a family with a high risk person, then they're going to have to guide their actions accordingly, because if their kids go to school and their kids bring it home and they're or asymptomatic, but the person in the household gets sick, it could be lethal or it could be very dangerous. Whereas if you've got a generally healthy, younger household and you're willing to risk because largely you're probably going to be fine even if you get it over the short term, you make that decision. I would add, however, that there's a ton of frustration, Alan, with regard to the slow progress of research and development and getting to the medical solutions that we need as a society. And people are asking, really, why is it like this? Why is it taking so long to figure out about either reworking existing medications or developing new therapeutics, or the whole question of whether or not to vaccinate and can it even be done? Let's, I think, take a step back and try and understand once again the healthcare contribution to this economic quagmire, and that is the history of the pharma industry is something, if we understand it, we can understand why, in part, this is going so slowly to be able to address it. The pharma industry is on a foundation that goes back over 100 years, and its beginnings are quite inglorious. It's a history of deceptive practices with ingredients, producing and selling products that are dangerous, untested, things like morphine, heroin, cocaine. They were used in virtually every substance. Wild and baseless claims were made about anything and everything. So it was really due to the incredible malfeasance of the pharma industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that led to so much legislation, the creation of many different government oversight committees and political actions and laws. And in 1906, the creation of the first incarnation, really, of the FDA. And it was known as the Pure Foods and Drugs Act. But even 60 years later, if you fast forward to the 1960s, the FDA was still a generally weak governmental organization. It lacked the capability to enforce laws, and they were usually overwhelmed and outgunned with all kinds of lobbying from the pharma industry, who were trying to do something to assess the validity of many largely untested drugs and devices. So with all of that said, the regulatory environment of today, the rigmarole that we have to work through to get things done is staggering. But we have to remember it's all a response to the government's attempt to protect people from deceptive and at times dangerous practices over decades and decades and decades. So it's not about what we did or didn't do in the last 2 years or 3 years. That's really a misnomer. This is a condition, what we're facing today, frankly, that we should have been prepared for 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's really there's no excuse, and there should never have been a surprise that there was going to be, and there was at some point, a pandemic. We couldn't obviously predict what the virus would be, but we've had decades to prepare. And the WHO, the CDC, the FDA, the American Medical Association, AHA, countless medical societies, the federal, state governments, global pharma, everybody alike gets an F in being ready for what's happened. They weren't prepared. So what we have to understand is that with this environment of it going to take so much time, there's got to be so much regulatory involvement in all the rigmarole, people are going to have to siphon through lots of information that's generally presented for the lay audience in a very oversimplified and consequently incorrect manner. And people are going to have to bone up on their science and make decisions that are going to be important for their well-being and their own family. That's a place, and that's one huge differentiating factor with regard to what we're facing today with the COVID pandemic and other economic downturns in the history of the United States.
Yeah, that's very true. Very, very true. What do can you briefly address how the pandemic is going to impact the private sector? I should say private medical practice, hospitals, and the research and development, because we've had 100% of we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, 100% of our resources going, boom, COVID-19, 100%. And, to what extent is it putting at risk basically the foundation of our day-to-day healthcare system?
Well, healthcare providers are trained to deal with difficult things, Alan. And surgeons and hospital administrators are in the business of dealing with pretty severe issues. So I have confidence that the backbone of medical providers in this country are going to stand up to the challenges, and they have in many ways, relative to dealing with the onslaught of the pandemic. But I also want to say that the word onslaught is something that needs to be directed to very limited hotspots within the United States. There's an enormous amount of waste as a result of the many of the directives in terms of moving resources away from the operating room and other types of healthcare services to prepare the service of COVID-19 patients that did occur in a number of these in a catastrophic way, and didn't occur in many other cities around the United States, where you have empty hospitals and empty operating rooms and furloughed medical staff and people getting 30% pay cuts who haven't done anything other than follow the directive of moving from their surgical appointments to managing on the end population health. And there wasn't anything to manage, because what we are faced with is that there is, at this point, a tremendous downturn in people call for ambulances. We have a lot of EMT and emergency services simply not being used the way they were. People are afraid to go to the doctor or the hospital, and they're dying in their home. They are avoiding necessary health care, and that's going to blow up. So as things start to get back to a more regular cadence of people who need to see physicians and have surgery and so on, need medical care, as that starts to open up again, the overall healthcare service demands are going to be extreme. We have concerns here at CAVA, working with hospitals with robotic surgery programs, that robotic programs and other minimally invasive surgical programs, when they restart, you're talking about surgeons and crew that haven't been operating for months. There's a degradation of capability there. You're going to have a crew and surgeons that are demanded upon with regard to tremendous volumes of surgery. I've heard and read reports that it could take 2 years to clean up the backlog of all the surgery that's been delayed. You have to wonder quality as you get into all of these issues. So we should have confidence in the integrity, the fortitude of our providers relative to standing up to this. But the reality is, as human beings, there's going to be a lot of demands placed upon them, and the burden of the onslaught is going to take its toll. We have hospitals nationally that are filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection because they're not generating revenue from their elective surgery, which is really the economic engine of most hospitals. So that's been stopped. As a result, the revenue is not flowing into the system. I've read of reports from surgeons saying, "All my patients are gone. I'm back in business relative to surgery, but people are not coming back." So people are going to have to be coaxed out of their hiding places and made confident that the healthcare system can respond appropriately. Going to the dentist is going to be an adventure in being in a room with somebody with PPE on. It's not going to be a comfortable experience for the patient for a while. So there's going to be a boomerang effect in terms of all of these medical accommodations that have to be made over the short term, 6 months, a year, 18 months, and then hopefully it'll start to find its way back to the middle somewhere.
Josh, you raised some very interesting points. I mean, it's one thing I think that we should not forget. Everybody is applauding and what the healthcare workers have been doing over these past couple of months in particular, but their work is going to be ongoing, and they're going to be facing even with one, we're going to have to live with COVID. We have to learn to coexist with it. We may have and come up with a vaccine for it at some point in the future. But in the interim, life has to go on, and we have to learn to coexist with it. And the same is true for all the people in the medical field. And one area that I'm sure people hadn't thought of is that, well, once the emergency room part of COVID-19 is over, they're actually going to be facing ongoing challenges beyond that, simply for the reasons that you've stated before. We're limited on time. We're going to have to move forward. Peter, sorry it took us a while to get to you. Peter is with the Utah Foundation, and he does a lot of work for the government, the state government, in terms of research, and perhaps maybe you could begin by talking about you just recently released a report on your April teleworking. What were your big takeaways?
Well, I think the main thing is that telework is here to stay. We obviously are going to see a big return over time to office spaces, but the proportion of our teleworkers is going to settle into a new high, and then we'll start to build back up on a long-term upward trajectory again. With that, there are some pretty big implications for instance, how we build and renovate our houses. Home offices will be a bigger deal than they were in the past. It may somewhat constrain the growth of office developments going forward, although some people predict that office spaces will actually need to get bigger to accommodate workers' desires for social distancing. So there's a habit of mind forming that's not going to disappear entirely. A subset of telework is telemeeting. To the extent that telemeeting, as we're doing it right now, becomes the way of the future, the travel industry and governments that depend on business travel for tax revenues will have to adjust. But going on from there are 4 other big changes I think we can expect along those lines. And these are items that really were already in motion, but because our habits are getting solidified through this crisis, there are things that we can now see being on fast forward. So one of those will be that retail is never going to be the same. We're buying online like never before. people that never before ordered their groceries online are now making a regular habit of it, and they're not going to stop. I think people will one day happily return to dining out, but online ordering for restaurant pickup and delivery has become a much bigger feature of the food service industry, and I think it will remain. The Goliath, Amazon, is just getting stronger and fatter. There's only so much market share to go around. Retailers, groceries, and restaurants that were already in the bubble or failed to adapt will not be back. It will fall, I think, it'll be a test of the entrepreneurial spirit of the next generation to snap up those defunct retail locations, draw customers back in. In the meantime, there are huge implications for land use, economic development, and tax policy from a local government standpoint, as they find that long held game of chasing retailers doesn't pay off like it used to, because the point of sale has shifted from the Walmart or the big box shopping center to somebody's house or office. Another change, I think, teleeducation. It's grabbing a more prominent seat at the table. So for years, there's been an aversion to teleeducation in higher education, and some of that is rational and prudent, but some of it was emotional and frankly, maybe snobbish. So how much difference is there between sitting in a core curriculum class with 200 other university students being taught by a grad student compared to watching the same class in your pajamas at home? Then on the K-12 level, a certain percentage of parents, I've seen polling that shows that more parents are now, through this experience, considering teleeducation than those who are less likely to consider teleeducation. So a greater proportion of children will be homeschooled in the future. And let's say it's only 5%. That's a huge shift. The wider embrace of teleeducation, one advantage is it should put downward pressure on the cost of education across the board, which has been a huge concern in terms of personal debt. And of course, from the standpoint of taxpayers, and hopefully would open up a greater variety of educational opportunities to a wider range of learners. Kind of picking up on Josh's talk, I think telehealth's moment has arrived. The telehealth visits have gone up exponentially. One health system executive that I know well estimated an increase of roughly 450 times the pre-corona numbers for telehealth visits, 450 times. So there are practical limitations to telehealth, obviously, and the health sector has to be careful to draw those lines, but it will be a prominent feature of healthcare, I think, from now on. And that can drive down overall healthcare costs and expand access, hopefully, to rural areas and other areas that are underserved by bricks and mortar health facilities. I'd also say that I think commercial transactions are losing touch. I'll be happy to hear Robert correct me on any of this, but touchless transactions, which were already being employed to save money, can now be justified in the name of public health and social expectations. So where you might have gone to a service counter to rent a car or make a deposit with personal assistance, increasingly businesses will be deploying technology to circumvent those transactions. That'll allow them to better deploy their personnel or save on personnel costs and even on bricks and mortar. I think we'll see a continued and rising wave of shutdowns in bank branches, more of the self-checkout at stores, fewer cash transactions, fewer paper checks issued, more secure online legal and financial transactions, more self-check-in at airports, hotels, car rental facilities. It'll be interesting to see whether the mail service discontinues as junk mail revenues have plummeted. You've probably seen your mailbox volume go way down, and that has consequences for the Postal Service. So the question arises, well, why do we even have daily delivery anymore if we're making all these transactions online now and depending less on important correspondence by mail? We'll also see a big movement of public services to speeding up to online, and I think citizens will not regret that. I mean, who wants to wait in line at the DMV, for instance? So those are five areas that I feel really confident about. I would call those sure bets. There are a number of wild cards that I see too. Um, One is, what is the ultimate impact of our public sector crisis investments and stimulus? Are we plugging
Yep.
holes, or are we investing in things that will generate jobs and give us long-term benefits? Like investing in infrastructure, for instance, gives you both. That's more appealing from a certain perspective than just boosting people's unemployment to the point where they actually don't have an incentive to go back to work. Another one would be looking at public debt globally is just going through the roof. You know, what are the long-term impacts of, not that we have a choice right now necessarily, but what are the long-term impacts of running these massive deficits? Inflation, stagflation. Another one, will our new consciousness of social distancing translate into a sort of longer-term hypochondria, if I could use that word, where people begin to have an aversion to density in the way they live? I saw a report from Moody's where they seem to think so. They actually predicted that denser cities will start losing out to less dense places like Provo and Salt Lake in Utah. Another one, will the aversion to crowds lead to long-term consequences for the big group gatherings like sporting and music events and festivals? What happens to movie theaters, and for that matter, then the film industry? Will that aversion to crowds cause people to reject mass transit for commuting? And what will be the consequences for transit and then for traffic generally? Will businesses use this occasion of layoffs and access to cheap capital to invest in automation? And what does that do to the jobs picture? Big one I'm really curious about is deglobalization. You know, this has kind of in the past been a pet project of strange bedfellows. You had the social justice warriors on one side and the nationalists on the other. And now it's become kind of a mainstream thing, and much broader support for deglobalization now. And so will the efficiencies that global commerce brought, will that be overwhelmed by this economic nationalism and policy interventions to shorten supply chains? And I guess there's changing consumer sentiments too about where things are coming from. Here's another big one. Are we going to look back on this and say these lockdowns were a massive mistake? And what does that do to our trust in institutions? Josh talked about this a little bit, all the conflicting information, all of the so-called experts telling us one thing one month and a different thing the next month. They're contradicting each other. Trust in the media, already in the basement before any of this happened due to the rising partisanship and declining journalistic standards. You know, I used to, once upon a time in the 90s, I was a business journalist. That's how I was trained as an undergrad. You know, I look at it and it's barely recognizable as an industry, and the standards are not what we were taught. And what does that do to public trust? What happens when Americans can no longer operate from a trustworthy common script anymore? So I could go on. I'm trying to be conscious of the time.
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
No, you raise, you know, thank you very much, Peter. I think you raised a lot of interesting points, and it shows to what extent that you know, this the way I kind of view what the COVID-19 leading up to COVID-19, there was a lot. You had a sense that the world was about to make a big change in terms of direction, in terms of where its priorities are and where it's going. We're already seeing signs of deglobalization taking effect. We were seeing really more of a tripolar world, if you will. You know, that being the Americas, Europe, and Asia, and what COVID-19 did is basically accelerate a lot of change.
Right.
It is accelerating a lot of change, and all of the things that you mentioned, we could talk about each one of them individually for an hour. But I think what it's going to do is it's going to accelerate that change, and um, and it's going to be very interesting to see how we come out the other side. There are obviously going to be winners and losers. They're going to be, it's going to take. There's going to be some areas of business that, in 6 months they will have bounced back and be back to where they were pre-crisis, and there are going to be others like in the services and the tourism business or whatever like that, where it's going to take years before they get back. But when you talk about the potential changes in terms of medical and in terms of education in particular, we've had the technology there to do televisits with your doctor, which can be a huge cost savings, and using basically teleservices for education that can also significantly reduce costs to the average consumer, and rid the average American from a lot of debt by sending their kids to college. So there are a lot, we can't look at it all as a negative and hardship. I think we'll come out the other side if we approach it with enthusiasm and with an open mind, better as a nation, better as a country, better as a state, better as individual families, post-COVID. And I'm not talking the next 3 months, but I'm talking, several years from now, we'll look back on this and say, boy, that was tough, but we did come out better for it. Troy, I know we've run out of time. Do you have any questions from anybody that we should try to address, or do we not have time for that?
We are really out of time. I do appreciate everybody's perspectives and insights onto it. I thought it was a very interesting conversation. Great job moderating it, Alan. We do have free prizes. Josh Fieldstein has donated some CDs from his jazz band and some other stuff that he's donated as giveaways. So everybody, please participate. Blue Sky's giving away a really nice nomadic bag. It's a travel bag, which may not be the best application today, but maybe one day we go back to that. And then now CFO is giving away an iPad. So please go visit the exhibitor booths. And if you guys have any final parting comments, we can probably take a minute. The next panel discussion starts at 10:10. So we're there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, panelists. Much appreciated, and thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Troy.
All right.
It was good to be on with everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Great job.